Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for episode 9 of Designing for the Desert, our weekly series exploring how design, innovation, and sustainability are shaping the future of life in arid regions. Over the past episodes, we've heard from architects, sustainability leaders, and urbanists on topics ranging from luxury and resilience to human centric urbanism. Today, we take that conversation a step further, looking at the broader scale of cities and ecological systems. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Velegrinis, Design Director and Head of the Cities Practice at Gensler across Asia Pacific and Middle East and Africa. Stephen brings more than 30 years of experience in urban design, landscape architecture, and ecological urbanism, with landmark projects like the Dubai Expo 2020 Master Plan, District 2020 Legacy Master Plan, and Hatta Tourism Master Plan, and many others across the Gulf, Africa, and Asia. His work rethinks the relationship between nature and the city and how master plans can move beyond sustainability toward resilience and regeneration. In today's session, Stephen will share his perspective on ecological urbanism strategies for desert regions, with lessons drawn from both global case studies and his extensive work here in the Middle East. So, without further ado, let's welcome Stephen.
Thank you so much, Udeet. I really appreciate the introduction and the invitation to be here. It's something of a privilege to be able to sort of talk about the things you really feel passionate about, and this is one of those things that I have a great deal of passion for, and a lot of what I'll be sort of talking through today it speaks to the approach that we take to all projects. This isn't a lot of what we do now is not where someone comes and asks us to do something that is driven by an ecological urbanism approach or anything like that. So I'll take you through some slides to begin with, and I really wanted to sort of focus on how we might think about the way that we could apply a lot of the thinking for these sort of projects across multiple scales, and I'm going to try and sort of do that through a few case studies at different scales. One of the sort of central questions that I often ask, and this particularly is when I'm involved in teaching of design students, is to question the nature of nature. In most respects, we always think about city as one thing and nature as something else. Nature is a place outside of the city. And I really do try to question that. So that leads to a different definition of what are cities. And if we design, instead of cities, but a nature caused by people, how does that lead to sort of different outcomes? And I'll talk through a couple of quick sort of international projects that inspired me, and then take you through some of the projects that I've been lucky to be involved in. But that first question, what's the nature of nature, is something I sort of do as an exercise at the outset of a lot of sort of teaching exercises in particular. And I'm going to cycle through a few of these images that almost universally, the answer when I say, is this nature, tends to be yes. And then we start to look at the way that nature is defined in sort of text. And when we look at things like the material world, especially as surrounding humankind and without human beings or civilization, which really does reinforce this idea that nature is something separate and outside our existence. But by the same token, other definitions of nature talk about anything that is born is nature. And that essentially opens the possibilities of everything being nature. To highlight that point, I'll go through these images again. In all of these areas, you see human impact, whether it's in the atmosphere, in paths that are created, in roads, in removal of trees, in poles on the horizon, trees trimmed from their bottoms to be providing fodder, to obviously buildings, paths. Any of those elements are human impact. So if you divorce human impact from nature, then none of these are nature. So to me, that raises a sort of really important question of how we think about nature. And I often talk about this idea of the cyborg landscape. And just like this image is, vegetation that wouldn't have naturally grown there, greenhouses and photovoltaic skins. Does this still qualify as nature because there are human-made elements in there? And what I would argue is that we need to start thinking of it that way. The nature of the problem that we face forces us to reconsider the way we see nature and how we relate to it. And there's some very, very clear challenges that you're all more than aware of. But cities themselves are accounting for 70% of global CO2 emissions. They will grow at least by 15% by 2030. So that's in the number and quantum of sort of urban areas. That 80% of that growth is in developing countries, and that those places where these cities are growing are coinciding with climate change and ecosystem collapse. So that means that we as designers, as professionals, need to change our approach. We need to think about everything we do, every design project, as resilient and regenerative, as well as master planned and optimized. And a really sort of critical point in this, and a really simple way to think about it, is to say, well, let's move away from designing for humanity. And a lot of definitions like sustainability relate only to humanity. And we think about designing for all living systems. So as, in a way, positioning ourselves as custodians that are essential in the role of protecting all of these different let's say all these different sort of living systems that we can aid, conserve, improve. And why do we need to do it? I mean, these graphs are some of the 9. They explore the 9 boundaries that the IPCC is defined as. When we cross these boundaries, we will have caused an unavoidable ecological collapse. Now, as of 2 years ago, we've crossed 6 of 9 boundaries, and arguably we've gone beyond that already. So we can't delay. We can't sort of say there will be some sort of magical technology in the future. We need to start straight away, because realistically, what we're doing is what this picture is showing. We're sitting on the branch and sawing it off at the same time, and if we don't start to see, in particular, in the design professions, that we are causing our own downfall, then essentially we won't get anywhere. We will fail to address the problems we could have addressed. And there is some important semantics around the language that we use. And this graph shows a sort of interesting comparison between what we usually call green or sustainable versus restorative and regenerative. In really, really basic terms, what we're doing now is a do less damage model. And it's the left-hand side of this graph, where we're still doing damage, but slightly less damage. And that's simply not going to get us there. It's just not going to do anything other than continue us down to a sort of climate path that is well understood, that is close to the worst case that is being modeled. And really, in order to get to something towards what we're being compelled to do, we need to think about how we can actually regenerate. So when we start a design project, how can we actually conceive of a project that creates more life, that sequesters more carbon than it emits, that creates more food, water, energy, air than it sort of consumes? And only through that approach, only through this sort of regenerative system, can we fundamentally address those things. And remember, this has to be done at speed, in a situation where, especially in developing nations, we've got multiple cities evolving at the same time. And so that sets up complementary sort of goals. As I said, sustainability is really sort of minimizing the damage that we're doing. Regenerative sort of design is really going beyond that approach to revitalizing ecosystems or developing human ecosystems, where our goal is the improvement of health of natural systems. And there's a sort of related and important element, which is resilience. And that is, we have created a situation where our cities are vulnerable, and where we will see shocks like, sea level rise or earthquakes or other natural disasters that we need to address as well. So all of these things become important to pursue at the same time. Part of why we need to do that is also not just it's the right thing to do, but there are emerging sort of legislations that are coming out that things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures in Europe that are making fundamental changes outside of Europe. And so in projects we've worked on the Middle East and North Africa, they're affected by this legislation because, as an example, you cannot import, let's call them dirty products, so petrochemicals, conventional steel, conventional fertilizers into Europe anymore. So that changes also the requirements for economies outside of Europe. Many of you will have seen this graph where we look at essentially the scenarios that have been outlined by boards like the RPCC. And essentially, we are kind of on this business as usual trajectory right now. Where we're told we need to be is really at net zero. But in reality, we actually need to be into negative emissions. We could stop emitting carbon today, and we would still have a problem. So elements like drawing down atmospheric carbon need to be part of our plan. I also sort of like to stress that we cannot just have carbon tunnel vision. If we're thinking about all living systems, it means thinking about how water cycles, food, waste cycles, CO2, energy, materials all interrelate. And these sort of virtuous cycles, as we've called them before, have to actually reinforce one another. And essentially that becomes critical. We have a fairly clear understanding of what the likely impacts of climate change will be. And part of that will be massive migration out of areas which become less or uninhabitable, where we see sort of this climate migration that has already started, that we see. You can take simple examples like the city of Jakarta in Indonesia, where they've essentially given up the fight against sea level rise and decided to build a new inland capital city. And that's not an isolated case either. Here I show just a simple sort of illustration of Dubai, where I am, in a sea level rise scenario, which is one of the scenarios designed by IPCC. What you actually see is the vast majority of the existing urban fabric is enormously impacted by sea level rise. We face a very real possibility that in the coming decades, we will actually have to reconceive of how cities work in this region. And it goes beyond that. This last year, there was these sort of significant floods in places like Valencia that were sort of destructive as well. So we have to sort of come back to this question of nature. Is all of this that we deal with nature? And I argue yes. I actually talk about this in terms of this myth of pristine nature. What has happened is that for about 15,000 years, while we've been doing organized agriculture, we've actually been modifying our climate, and it's clear in the geological record. So we have to actually get away from this thing that ecologists often get sort of attached to, which is we need to return ecology to its pristine state, which is not that long ago. And that just isn't reality. Nature is a process that continues. And how is that different from cities? Well, we need to actually stop differentiating natural areas and cities. We need to see the earth as this sort of cyborg landscape that's part technology and part nature. And so I use this literary term of killing your darlings. that really is when authors talk about getting rid of one of their favorite ideas because it's not working. We need to get rid of that. We need to kill the darling of our nature culture duality. It has sort of been defined in the past where we weren't aware of the issues that we were creating. We don't have that excuse anymore. And so I really like this quote by Kurt Van Menspoort, who runs an organization called Next Nature. And he says we need to explore how we can design, build, and live in the nature caused by people. And that's really important, that conjoining of sort of nature and cities. If we can see, cities as cyborg landscapes, we accept that what we design should include nature and natural systems. That becomes a sort of driver for what we can do. And so I'm going to sort of talk very quickly through some fairly recent sort of large-scale examples that inspired a lot of our work. The first is the Big U from Bjarke Ingels Group, which was essentially a $1 billion park around the sort of lower end of Manhattan. When Superstorm Sandy hit New York, the impacts of the storm wiped out a lot of lower Manhattan for 6 to 7 months. And think about the sort of the financial damage that does by having an enormous chunk of the city that's not functional. So when we sort of look at this, we think, oh my goodness, this is a $1 billion park, but it's a park that actually operates as a flood barrier, which eliminates far more potential damage and cost. And that investment needs to be thought of in that way. Another really great project that came out of the same rebuild by design process that the US went through was the Oyster Texture project by Scape Studio, where instead of actually deploying flood barriers that were grey infrastructure, concrete walls, etc., the proposal, which has now been the first stages have been implemented, was to deploy oyster reefs instead. Oysters had been a feature of the local ecology before development, and because of the pollution of the waterways, in particular the Gowanus Canal where this was situated, that ecology had been completely destroyed. But oyster reefs, and reefs in general, do a massive amount of work in terms of diffusing storm damage. And so this idea of deploying a natural system as flood defense was particularly valuable because it wasn't just flood defense. It was also actually a water cleaning system. So oysters are bivalves. They filter 20 liters of water per hour. So in the course of time, these oyster reefs not only prevent storm damage and filter water and drastically improve water quality, but they also eventually provide a clean food source, a source of economic growth in terms of people to work these oyster reefs, and also the ways that the shelter created by oyster reefs stimulates local ecologies. These are sort of really great examples of how we can actually think about well beyond single-use infrastructure and well beyond a sort of single user. And in a similar respect, a competition at Shanghai that was won by Field Operations looked at that first, set up the entire strategy for the city based around these sort of green fingers that would actually treat the quite severe pollution that was in the bay, and then thought about the way that the city could actually wrap inside these. And again, the first stages of this project have been developed. There's been a significant amount of work, mainly centered around places like the AA in the UK, where the idea of landscape urbanism and sort of landscape systems as a driver of design became sort of critical elements. And I've seen in our region also, examples where conventional or seemingly conventional development starts to turn these things on their head. And so Dubai Sustainable City is a net zero energy city. You see in the middle of the project the biomes where they grow their own food, they process their own wastewater on site, and probably the most interesting thing has been that this, as a project, the value of the buildings there has outperformed the value of buildings elsewhere. And so now we actually see the same developer having 6 or 7 other projects that aim towards this net zero approach to development. It's conventional. in a way now, and it's actually something that people pay a premium for, and we need to think about that as the way that we address the design challenges that we see. So I'm going to show just 3 quick case studies at different scales to show how we've used that in recent years. We're continuing to do this quite across the board on our projects. But these are ways that we have sort of thought about how we view cybernetic ecological landscapes and how we think about connecting measures across ecosystems and cities. And so the first one I'm going to show you is a citywide application. And this was some years ago when we were approached by the mayor of the city who said, I'd like to build a marina in the mouth of the river. This is a city in southern Turkey on the Mediterranean coast. And they said, we'd like to build a marina in the mouth of this river, but it keeps on flooding. And so we were tasked with designing a marina. When we looked at it, the issue became quite obvious for us. As you can see in this render, the mountains behind the city are quite large, and they're not surprisingly snow-capped mountains. And when the springs come, these snow-capped mountains melt, and the water comes downstream, and it actually creates fluvial flooding. Essentially, a very sort of simple sort of logic. Whereas we had essentially a very small project at the bottom of this image, our issue was we were saying, well, look, fluvial flooding is not your only problem. You're seeing seawater incurred into the water corridor as well. And this was the only source of drinking water for the city, which was planned to double in size in the next 20 years. And so we said, well, you not only have to solve flooding, you have to address climate change and sea level rise, and you can. And the other challenge that was sort of posed to us was a very unusual sort of way it was put. The mayor of the city said, well, we have 400 5-star prisons. And we said, what do you mean? And he said, well, look, we have lots of tourists coming to our beach resorts. There's 400 of them. People go there. They don't leave. They don't experience the city. They don't share the economic benefit with the whole city, and then they go. And so there was a sort of economic diversification that was needed, and that would absolutely be required in terms of the future growth of this population. So we tried to actually look at the drivers for this project across all of those requirements. That the key elements that we were sort of driven by was, of course, the water systems, the existing historic agriculture zones, which were mainly historic orange groves, obviously the topography and the coasts. And so our stated intentions were really about restoring ecosystems, protecting the city from flooding, establishing a sustainable water management system, diversifying the economy, connecting people to the natural systems, and to celebrate the sort of quite significant agricultural assets. And so we proposed to this client, and they sort of went with us on this journey to say, well, look, actually to solve this problem, you need to zoom out. You need to look at the entire regional watershed and what we can do to actually prevent the problem before it gets to the mouth of the creek. Because if you don't do that, it doesn't matter what great infrastructure you build, it will eventually fail. And so we zoomed out to the entire regional watershed, which was about 927 square kilometres, and then eventually zoomed into a smaller area of about 60 square kilometres to do a master plan. And so we had essentially argued that you don't look at this problem in isolation. Think about this as a solution for the city. Mapping, the first and most important way was indexing the ground levels, and that was looking at how does water flow across this landscape? Why does that lead to floods? And part of that was saying, well, what can we build? Where can we build? And obviously, any of the areas here that are orange and red are just not buildable. But that also tells us where water flows. And when we did the water flow simulations, which we did through a simple scripting process in Grasshopper and Rhino, what we noticed was these water systems were all branching systems, and that there was logical places in the landscape where if we actually intervened at those points, then we can actually drastically slow down the peak flows of water going into the mouth of the creek. And so that became something that really was the beginning point of a strategy for the whole project. We then looked at the sort of things like field boundaries of the agricultural fields. Not surprisingly, they kind of coincided pretty well with the way that the water system worked. And so it suggested a geometry. And we adapted that geometry to form a couple of loops. That's when we started looking at elements like the existing city infrastructure, road connections, bridges, all those sorts of things, and how we could actually get the most bang for our buck out of infrastructure uses. When we put all that together, that led to what we call two environmental loops. And these were corridors that had a strong relationship to the water and agricultural fields, but also brought visitors to the city out to experience other parts of the city's potential, particularly in relation to tourism. What we succeeded in doing was actually to convince the government that they needed to actually use this as a basis for city planning. And so the way that this was used, these loops, were in saying that any land that touches these loops was eligible to be redeveloped. And what you see here is the loops and all the land that they touch, and along the roads, the environmental loops, you see a sort of shaded area where development could be allowed. So sharing the development potential with these private landowners. That sort of converted it in two ways. One, it was infrastructure projects like bridges and roads and water infrastructure and tidal barriers. But the other was actually development projects, where we wanted to actually show a number of examples that outlined how these could be sort of environmentally positive projects. And so the urban plan, essentially, if you look at the right-hand side of this, it's where we've actually added some sort of difference in the way that we thought about sites. We have our typical things in a master plan, like what is this site? How big is it? How much GFA can you build on it? What kind of land uses? But the things that were actually critically important were things like the urban typologies. What do you need to do in an urbanistic sense for this site to be developed? And secondly, what are the hydraulic functions? So simple things like creating a water detention reservoir in some of those branching locations, or creating sort of filtering wetlands, which were a precondition. If you wanted to develop the site, you needed to do the things that were required by the hydraulic function and by the urban typology. And so we showed that as a number of development examples. The first was obviously the marina we'd originally been asked to look at. And what you see here is a restoration of the creek, the wetlands environments of the creek. At the waterfront itself is a tidal barrier, which is also a road bridge across, stitching the two sides of the city together. So in these, we'd actually created a viable sort of marina system that wouldn't be subject to flooding. We'd secured the water supply long-term for the city with it, and prevented the incursion of salt water into the area, protected as a whole the waterfronts of the city from sea level rise, and created significant development potential and ecological growth. And so, for us, a key, or for the client, this ended up being a key part of the way they spoke about this project in terms of giving back to the city. The city had turned its back on this corridor. And so we also went through in terms of other sites, how that could be, as the example at the top shows, a daylighting of a concrete canal. So we created an ecologically active sort of river corridor that is then, there's a good reason for new development around it. And at the bottom, at the junction of these two rivers, where this land was adjacent to agricultural fields, where we had a lot of issues with things like fertilizers running off into the water system and then going into the water supply, that this project needed to also act not just as a development, but as a constructed wetland that would receive, clean, and release the waters to the creek environs. So, in a sense, this real sort of joining of the ecological functions that are required and the urban functions. That is not an approach that's limited to large sites. And this was a waterfront design competition that we looked at in the coast of Saudi Arabia, where we'd started looking at this project from a purely urban approach. But when we actually looked at what are the real challenges of this site, this was just a simple sea level rise projection just for the next 50 years. You can obviously see the site is significantly affected. In a way, fortunate for us, a couple of weeks before the design competition, there was actually quite significant floods in and around the site. So we were simply saying you cannot ignore this. But we also said, why did this happen? And when we looked over the historical sort of photos, this was actually a salt marsh, and salt marshes are one of the top two carbon sequestering landscapes there exists behind mangroves. So what we sort of see is the infilling, the reclamation of this land is a kind of short-sighted strategy. So our question to ourselves was, well, how do we deal with that? What is the approach to this small site where we can address sea level rise? And the simple answer was, let's restore the salt marsh. Let's actually excavate away the fill that it created here, reinstate areas of salt marsh, build up the land around that salt marsh corridor, and create sort of development platforms that are well above the sea level rise. So that was the simple sort of move. The strategy was really about reinstating a natural system that could also earn carbon credits for the project, and then also protect all of the development that was to come. So in a fairly simple move at a sort of quite modest sort of city block scale, the idea was that we did as much as we could with this land in terms of things like renewable energy in the building integrated photovoltaics, also food growing areas within this site. So this was not a challenge. It was actually the logical outcome when you think of sort of nature-based solutions and designing for more than human life. And so all of those systems for our enjoyment, public open spaces, the way that buildings are sited, the movement networks actually were greatly assisted by this kind of approach. And so for us, the most important message here was that this is not a problem that can't be undone. This is a problem that we can easily deal with and must in terms of the solution, and gives us great opportunity to create amazing sort of public realms for this area. The final project I'm going to go through is coming down to a building scale, and I realise that time's dragging on a bit, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The simple premise we came up with was, what is the most difficult scenario we can imagine for an ecological approach to design? And we looked at the city of Cairo, which over the last few decades, its population had increased by 700%. It's a city of 22 million people. More than 60% of the people in Cairo live with less than half a square meter of open space. Remembering that the WHO recommends 14 square meters of open space per person. Right, so chronically underprovided in terms of open space. When we looked at where that underprovision was happening, of course, it was the most underserved communities were the lowest income communities. And so we were sort of saying that this isn't just a problem with overall quantity, but also distribution. So if we look at that, how do we actually look at these underprivileged areas and serve them better? How do we look at an urban fabric like this and say, well, where do we create an ecological infrastructure? Abandoned, it wasn't used. So water towers were used in previous decades to sort of pump water up to, and they would be the distribution system for water in that neighbourhood. Now we've got pressurised systems and we don't need the water tower. So our question here was, how much could we do with a structure like that? And of course, the greenest way to build is to not build at all. So we said, well, let's keep this existing water tower. Let's think of it as an ecological machine. So what could we do with that structure? and we looked at a way that we could on-site grow supplies of bamboo, manufacture that into cross-laminated timber structures, create an access system up those levels and these elevated terraces that serve a number of purposes. So things like growing food, or processing wastewater from the neighborhood, or providing social incubator space for the neighborhood, and also green space. To really think about this as a sort of antidote to urbanism. And that's why we kind of called it the probiotic tower, that we saw this as something that could address the problems that we've created. And that was, in many ways, this idea that we could actually take something that currently doesn't have great value and make it into something sort of extraordinary for the most underserved population. You know, in doing so, we're providing public open space uh, through a combination of things like solar photovoltaics, algae biofacades, air supplies, vertical farms and with one another, and through things like processing of reeds, how we could also create things like biodiesel from reeds and from algae biomass. So really providing a whole set of benefits to the immediate neighborhood by looking at this project as an environmental machine. And so I guess for us, what the key message was that there is no excuse. We can actually intervene in all sites of all scales and achieve enormous sort of benefit. So looking at those sort of scales, the the key takeaways are really that we need to think of ecology as a basis for urban planning, and that natural processes are kind of a great model that we actually, if we run a system, then we achieve great things with this sort of outcome. So that's where we sort of get to this idea of synthetic landscapes and embracing things like landscape architecture's capability to sort of deal with uncertainty. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for that, and apologies I dragged on a bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that thought-provoking presentation. You've given us a real fresh perspective on what it means to design for the desert, not just sustaining cities, but reimagining them as ecological systems that regenerate, adapt, and also thrive. Right from the concept of the cyborg landscapes that you talked about, all the way to the lessons drawn from projects that you've done in different parts, including the Gulf and beyond. And your talk has really highlighted the possibilities of ecological urbanism. And especially for arid regions, that's something that addresses so many different resources and how nature exists and the processes that intertwine with the human aspects. So I'd like to now open the floor for a short question and answer session. I've prepared a few questions to dive a little deeper into your ideas. And we'll also welcome any reflections or questions from the audience who can also reach out on the live chat. So with that, let's get started with the discussion. So my first question is about the overall concept and philosophy. You've spoken about cities as cyborg landscapes. And how do you see technology and ecology working together in practical ways for desert urbanism?
Good. We will have seen through some of the presented material that the approach that we often take is a intentional combination of nature-based systems, and not entirely nature-based systems, but also how we can actually overlap that with technology. And so the final project, the probiotic tower, things like algae and algae pools are a sort of living system, but the way that they actually get, in a way, supercharged by technology and able to output things like fuels while sequestering carbon, are ways that we think about technology and nature working together. And in a way, all we're doing is really speeding up evolution. We're creating the possibility of an enhanced toolbox of elements that we can use. And that is really the essence of it. We sort of think, don't be uh, overly sort of dogmatic about ecology, because traditional ecology really says you should not do anything that it doesn't exist in nature, right?
Mm.
Um, and our contention is that you actually have to go step well beyond nature. Um,
All right. So that brings me to my next question, which is about trade-offs and the feasibility. In arid regions where resources are limited, what trade-offs do designers often face? Between the one pull, which is the feasibility and economic feasibility pull, and on the other side, the ecological responsibility and stewards of the environment and nature.
yeah, again, I think that's a really important question, and one that is easier to solve as time goes on. So one of the things that we've been working on recently, particularly in developing contexts, responsibility to pay for it. And so uh, one of the ways that we've sort of worked towards that in finance market that was available for renewable energy. It could be carbon sequestration, it could be clean water. Any of these sort of SDG goals are usually eligible to leverage sustainable finance. Now, in 2023, the size of the global market for sustainable finance was about $6 trillion US. By 2034, it's going to be almost 40 trillion US. So there's an enormous amount of money out there that could actually encourage people to do the right thing by offering financial incentives. And so one example I can give from literally a competition we've just completed in the last few weeks is we looked at a site that had natural capability to grow significant amounts of bamboo. And so we designed the entire project to be a site-grown material strategy, both natural bamboo and engineered wood from bamboo. We looked at a self-sufficiency strategy for energy. We harvested water from the site and reprocessed wastewater on site. Um, and we looked at ways that we could actually reduce private vehicular traffic into the project. All of those components that I've just described were packaged up into a system where we said actually these could all be funded by a combination of carbon credits, climate funds, green bonds, sustainable finance from banks, etc., which give you a great return. And in a way, we've got to find a way to make these things not just nice to do because it makes us feel good, but also because it makes financial sense. And until we do, we won't actually succeed at implementing these projects. So that I think is the fundamental shift that we see.
Wonderful. Um, So resilience is key in desert cities, and especially with extreme heat and flash floods. What urban design
Mhm.
strategies could best balance both slow stresses and sudden shocks?
Mm. Well, look, I think probably using a direct example, Dubai had significant floods in in last year, April last year. The entire city was quite significantly affected for several months from the floods. Now everyone sort of assumed that this was just you couldn't anticipate it, but it had been predicted. What is also predicted in many locations is an increase in the incident and severity of flood events or storm events. So there is a sort of we need to address those chronic shocks that often become sort of sudden resilience issues. Um, One of the critical things is that you can either do that as the city has currently done by building a giant sewer tunnel to take that as much water as possible away and run it into the sea, which transfers the problem to the sea. You know, you're essentially polluting the ocean by doing that. The other way to do it is to look at using open space in cities as a infrastructure, making every park and public open space actually able to accommodate, slow down, and treat contamination in floodwaters, so that it slowly sort of is cleaned and then released, or used as a resource. Now, both of those things exist. There is this sort of requirement from increased rainfall, but there's also a desire in the 2040 master plan in Dubai to quadruple the amount of public open space. So actually, it's in bringing those two things together, which again we can sort of then structure with a sustainable finance solution to say you should do all of these things that you're wanting to do, but do them in a smart way where you're addressing multiple issues with one tool. You can also look at the enormous effect that green spaces in the city, particularly in the Gulf, have on heat and outdoor thermal comfort. And then again, layer in another level of significance for that. So it's in the smart deployment of natural systems that those sorts of things can be addressed and addressed in an efficient way.
All right. Now I'm going to move to a slightly different aspect, which is around people and culture.
Mhm.
So, how do large-scale projects in places like the UAE or KSA remain people-centered while tackling climate and resource challenges as well? And I think we did see some examples in your presentation as well. I just thought I'd kind of highlight and focusedly ask you about this particular uh, question.
Yeah, and it's sort of a really critical point because I spend a lot of time emphasising that we're not designing just for humans, but that doesn't mean we don't design for humans at all. Ultimately, what's good for a balanced ecology is also great for humans, and so things like biodiversity have indirect critical wellness impacts for people, right? And remember, in all cities in the region and well beyond, people existed prior to modernism in a way that was very connected to landscapes. And so, if you think about things like environmental psychology, there's very clear landscape preferences hardwired into our brains that actually provide the most mental restoration, the most comfort. Simple things like a great study that was done years ago on pain medication in hospitals looked at, well, what is the pain medication that someone requires in a room that has a view of trees versus a room that doesn't have a window at all. And on average, people who had a view of trees from a window had 20 to 30% less pain medication required. So part of that is actual that preference, landscape preference. So we can sort of think about in very long timescales and shorter timescales that people were much more connected to natural systems in the past, and they need that connection for the sake of wellness. So actually, in doing these kinds of approaches, yes, there's some differences in the way that we do nature, but ultimately it's the same sort of story. We're restoring people's connection to something they need to be connected to.
Super. So, my next question is about um, the role of local cultural practices. So, what role do local cultural practices and traditions play in shaping the ecological urbanism in deserts? And how can designers avoid imposing purely global models while this evolution happens?
Yeah, and look, we are in a very lucky position in our organisation that in the last 2 years we've been able to work in places like the Philippines, Laos, Thailand, India, the Maldives, Kenya, Nigeria, Libya, Guatemala. And the question that comes from that is often, are you imposing something on a place that is a foreign sort of concept? And that's really a fundamental problem that modernism sort of introduced to the world. And what I would say is actually, in taking an ecological approach, it grounds you immediately in the local context. You're looking at the natural systems of that place that led to certain cultural practices. And so the project that I was mentioning that we recently completed, which was in Laos in Southeast Asia, one of the things, and this is entirely captured in terms of sustainable development goals as well, was how do we actually keep people in this place while and still allow for it to be developed. So in that instance, we had significant areas of rice paddies, traditional rice paddies in the site, but our developer wanted to actually put golf courses in there. So what we looked at was how can we actually keep the rice paddies and develop the golf courses, stimulate a new economy for those local residents around things like agritourism. How can we actually incorporate things like a training college in the project to uplift the economic opportunities for local people, and also being a sort of tourism focused destination, how do we actually get people to actually use all of their knowledge of craft, local craft, in a sort of local design institute and a cultural market where those things are not only preserved but actually introduced to the world. So it's in a way that holistic story. If you're designing for all people, including all life, including humans, then it means actually also conserving their way of life.
Super. I think, yes, you touched on a very specific point, which is about inclusivity. And my next question is also about that. With rapid urbanization and migration, how can
Mm-hmm.
new desert cities ensure inclusivity? So they're not just sustainable, but they're also socially resilient and
Yep.
for what the future holds.
Look, I think that we're already in a fairly privileged position in that respect. I live in Dubai. 11% of the population here are nationals. So we're 9 out of 10 people in this city are from somewhere else, and so it's the most diverse place I've ever been. Um, Prior to living and working in Dubai, I used to work in Singapore, where essentially it was the reverse, and more than 90% of the population were nationals. And so it was actually pretty difficult as someone from somewhere else to actually integrate. Here, it's really just not that difficult. I think the whole region is already accustomed to this idea of will not work without significant people coming in from somewhere else, and it is structured that way. It's come one, come all. Find your particular opportunity at this place. So I think that there's both a historic sort of openness in this region, and a sort of coming evolution of how that works to a more equitable sort of urban form that is particularly well served by giga projects, or just simply larger projects in the region, which really rely on people coming into this place. So I would say that it's baked in already. We just simply need to ensure that we recognise, again, you're designing for all life, including all types of human life and all backgrounds. That probably sounds a lot easier than it actually is, but we actually have to challenge ourselves that simply.
Super. All right. So, in the next couple of questions, I'm going to ask you are about case studies and lessons learned. And so,
Mhm.
in the case study of the Dubai Sustainable City, what worked well in practice and could be scaled to other desert contexts, and what didn't?
So that's a great example because it has been scaled and expanded. And so now you have sustainable city projects in Sharjah, the adjacent emirate, Abu Dhabi on Yas Island, Yiti in Oman. So the same developer has taken that model and applied it to sort of numerous other locations, and they have several others in development. Um, it comes back to the fact that people want the choice to live in a more sustainable way. And so being offered that choice, they're not only taking it, but they are paying a premium for it. And so it goes to this question of, can it actually be more profitable to do the right thing? And what we need to get to is that point where it is.
Absolutely. Your work spans continents. What is one global example of ecological urbanism that you believe Gulf cities could realistically learn
Um, I think one of the most important potential projects of the future, and I'd really commend everyone to have a good look at this. My former PhD supervisor, Professor Richard Weller, who recently passed away, one of the main things he did as the chair of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania was to start a sort of a strand of research that basically grappled with the question of, we've got massive amounts of cities growing in developing contexts, and in most places where they're growing is in direct conflict with biodiversity hotspots. And what he envisaged was a project that they called the World Park. And it was an ecological conservation of literally a linear park that spanned the entire world, particularly connecting all of the biodiversity hotspots. And they'd mapped that out. They'd done a study for a site in Bolivia that was the same, sort of part of that structure and that network. And it was all premised on the idea that development or humanity can coexist with natural systems, but we need to design it the right way. And it's such a bold and amazing vision, but it's actually eminently achievable. If we spent a fraction of what we spend on conflicts in creating this park, it could actually be easily created. There is, people who have philanthropically given entire sort of fortunes towards things like conservation projects, where one particular case I'm aware of, a Swedish billionaire essentially bought 3,500 hectares 3,500 square kilometers of rainforest in the Amazon from a logging company, and just left it alone. People are actually willing to invest in this. We've got, literally trillions of dollars available to invest in some of these projects. And there is a global sort of very clear idea that we could easily implement that would have major impacts on our climate change response. And so I think we actually need to embrace huge, big, bold ideas like that. And for me, that is the one that I think is most eminently achievable and impactful.
All right. So, I have the last couple of questions coming up. One is on policy. If you were advising policymakers today, what was the single shift in legislation or regulation that would most accelerate regenerative urban design in arid regions?
I would say the one regulatory change that is both urgent, necessary, and most impactful will be around how we can actually leverage sustainable finance. At the moment, it's so new that the biggest problem that people face is, how do I demonstrate the economic value of what I'm doing? So, one example that I'm aware of, a sort of really inventive company that would go and find degraded sites, regenerate those sites, particularly with things like mangrove locations, establish businesses in terms of agroforestry, and other sort of net positive sort of projects on these plots, and then seek finance from sustainable finance mechanisms, and then implement those projects. The problem that they often face was, well, no one agrees what the economic benefit of a mangrove is. Everyone agrees there's a benefit, but there's no understandable way for people to price the sort of economic benefit of doing these projects. And so it's not that these projects aren't useful or helpful, it's just that no one actually can agree in a way on how do we value those things. So one of the things that I've been partially involved in the last couple of years is an initiative at the Dubai International Financial Centre, DIFC, where they're looking to say, well, can we be, at least for this region, the people that define, sort of help with understanding valuations and really unlock the potential of this enormous amount of capital that is potentially there. And so I think actually in legislative and regulatory terms, it's simply in terms of compelling projects, particularly above a certain size, to actually take an ecological approach and then to have a very reliable sort of centrally managed system regulated through something like the IFC, that then guarantees that if you do the right thing, you'll also actually get a reliable financial return on that. So as a subtle shift, I mean, you're really not even investing in the funds themselves. You're just creating a system that allows funds to, or everyone globally, to agree, well, this is the value of, you know, creating a new mangrove area, and everyone agrees on that value, and then you can go to 10 different sort of financiers and they'll all agree that that's the value. You know, it's a simple, subtle change that is actually in relation to finance and the way that we value natural capital, that actually will have fundamental enabling opportunities for the sort of urbanism in the region.
Absolutely. So the financial aspect will then be able to support and make the paradigm shift that's happening in the built environment, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
change hand in hand along with that overall movement.
Yeah.
So my last question to you is, looking more into the future, by 2050, desert cities will face even higher temperatures and water
Mm-hmm.
scarcity. So, what gives you optimism that we can design not just to survive, but also to thrive?
Uh, what I would say is we've already done it. And what I mean by that is that the cities of the Gulf have done something that no one else in the world has done. So all cities around the world talk about urban heat island effects, right? Around the world, cities result in higher temperatures than their surrounding hinterlands. Some studies that were done around 10 years ago by MIT and Khalifa University actually discovered, almost accidentally, that Gulf cities have inverse urban heat island effects, and that cities, the city areas, are actually cooler than the surrounding desert lands that they have around them. And the most fascinating thing was how they figured out why that was happening. And I stress, this hasn't been demonstrated anywhere else in the world. But you've got situations where cities like Doha are 4 to 5 degrees cooler than their surrounding hinterland, Abu Dhabi around 6 degrees, Dubai up to 10 degrees. What they demonstrated by looking at historic satellite imagery was that around 30 to 40 years ago, these cities all started using wastewater, sewage, reprocessing that wastewater and delivering it back to the city in form of irrigation water, which meant that the amount of vegetation in Gulf cities grew significantly. They correlated the temperature differences with the increase in tree coverage exactly. And they demonstrated how it's a very clear, direct, and linear relationship with this urban heat island inversion. So I would say what gives me hope is that we've already done it, but the first time it was by accident. Now we actually know better. We have more tools. We have ways in which to address these. So I would say we don't have an excuse to argue that we can't do this.
Super, wonderful. So the fact that we've done it kind of tells us that it's possible, and we just need to do more of it and kind of adapt little by little and have everyone on board. Superb. So with that, my long list of questions comes to an end. Um, I'll just quickly check if you have any questions from the audience and if anyone has anything to ask. I'm sure they'll also have more questions over the coming week as more people go through this and see and watch this webinar. So just allow me a minute. Okay, so it looks
So I
like we
think,
have one question. Um,
yeah, so I'll just look at that question and just sort of addressing it directly. Aisha, thank you for the question. The question, the answer that I would give is that yes, you really can start now, and whether it's you know, you're designing a building and you design facades with small alcoves and openings in the facade that allow for bee colonies or birds to establish is a small move towards enhancing biodiversity. You know, looking at, and I would really commend you to look at the work of the Singaporean architects Woha. You can look at buildings as ways or measure your building projects with things like a green plot ratio. So they look in their projects and they track every one of their projects to say how much open space was there on this development site before we started, and then say, well, how much do we provide in the eventual development? And often, regularly, they're achieving 5 to 10 times more green space in the development than there was before the development. And they have become expert in things like vertical greening, sort of the use of sky gardens and how they can be. And they're all great things that actually increase the value of a project, you know, increase the return on investment. So I think that the simple answer is yes, you absolutely can. You just got to look for the opportunities in everything you do. And I have to say, I've failed far more times than I've succeeded, but I really feel good about myself if I've tried and failed. I don't feel really good if I haven't tried. So I think that just look for anything. The smallest opportunity is still a win.
Super. Do you have any other questions at the moment? Just check. All right. So maybe the questions that do come in, you can always reply on the chat. Okay, so I think we close for today. Thank
Thank
you
you so
very
much.
much, Stephen, for sharing your vision and your expertise with us today. It's very nice to have you here. Your talk reminded us that desert cities don't have to choose between growth and ecology. They can become living systems where technology, culture, and natural processes all work together.
Mm-hmm.
From the idea of cyborg landscapes to practical lessons from master plans across the Gulf and beyond. This was a fascinating look at what ecological urbanism really means in our context. And to everyone who joined us, Thank you for being part of today's conversation. The Designing for the Desert series is about learning from different voices and building a collective understanding of how we can shape sustainable futures in the arid regions. We'll be back next Sunday at 2 p.m. the right time with another episode, so stay tuned. Until then, stay curious, stay climate conscious, and keep designing with purpose. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.